right? Picture this. You've just broken up with someone. Messy divorce, years of arguments, finally signed the papers, changed the locks, and then suddenly you're sliding into their DM saying, "Hey, fancy getting back together? Oh, and by the way, you can set all the house rules this time." That, my friends, is essentially what's happening with Sir Keir Starmer and the European Union right now. And spoiler alert, it involves your electricity bills, your boiler, and possibly forcing you into an electric car whether you like it or not. Quick favor, if you're enjoying this chaos, smash that subscribe button. Over 94% of you haven't yet. It's completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps us keep bringing you this content. Cheers if you did. Right, back to the drama. So let us set the scene, shall we? Sir Keir Starmer, our beloved Prime Minister, along with his trusty sidekick Energy Secretary Ed Miliband, have been quietly negotiating behind closed doors. And what are they negotiating, you ask? Oh, nothing major, just handing over control of Britain's entire energy policy to Brussels. No big deal, right? Just casually surrendering sovereignty over one of the most critical aspects of national infrastructure. What could possibly go wrong? Here is where it gets absolutely juicy. Starmer wants to rejoin the EU internal electricity market. Now, on the surface, that might sound reasonable. Share some electricity, cooperate on energy, all very friendly and European. But hold on a minute, because Brussels has come back with a list of demands that would make even the most hardened negotiators spit out their tea. The EU has basically said, sure, you can come back to our electricity party, but only if you completely reshape your entire energy policy to match ours. It is like asking to borrow someone's Netflix password and them responding with, only if you also clean my house, walk my dog, and adopt all my life choices. The Telegraph has reported that these negotiations would see Britain's net zero targets effectively doubled. Doubled. Not slightly increased, not gently adjusted, but practically doubled overnight. Brussels is demanding that the UK achieve 42.5% of its energy from renewables by 2030, with aspirations to hit 45%. Meanwhile, Britain's current target sits at a modest 22%. That is not just moving the goalposts, that is picking them up and relocating them to an entirely different stadium in a different country. Now let us talk about what this actually means for you and me, the ordinary people who are just trying to keep the lights on without remortgaging our homes. Energy experts, the people who actually understand this stuff beyond political soundbites, have spelled it out pretty clearly. Meeting these EU targets would require massive, and I mean absolutely massive, acceleration in replacing gas boilers with heat pumps. And if you have ever looked into the cost of heat pumps, you will know they are not exactly cheap. We are talking thousands upon thousands of pounds. So while politicians sit in their comfortable offices negotiating these deals, you are the one who will be footing the bill. But wait, there is more. Because apparently that is not enough pain for British households. The plan also involves adding biofuels to petrol and diesel, which will undoubtedly increase costs at the pump, and forcing more drivers into electric vehicles. Now, do not get me wrong, electric vehicles are fantastic if you can afford one, if you have somewhere to charge it, and if you do not need to drive long distances regularly. But for millions of people across Britain, particularly in rural areas, this is not just inconvenient, it is completely impractical. Shadow Energy Secretary Claire Coutinho has absolutely not held back in her criticism. She has accused Sir Keir of surrendering control of our energy system to bureaucrats in Brussels. And honestly, when you look at the details, it is rather hard to argue with her assessment. She warned that UK ministers would be forced to reduce emissions regardless of what it does to people's energy bills or the competitiveness of businesses. Let that sink in for a moment. Regardless. That means even if your energy bills skyrocket, even if British businesses become uncompetitive on the global stage, the government would still be bound by these EU rules. That is what surrendering control actually looks like. This bombshell came to light after the document was mysteriously published on the Cabinet Office website. Whether this was intentional transparency or an accidental leak, we may never know. But what we do know is what the document says, and it is rather alarming. The scheme would make UK energy policy subordinate to EU jurisdiction. Subordinate, that is the actual word used. Britain would no longer have the final say over its own energy policy. Instead, Decisions would need to align with EU mandates. The document explicitly states that the electricity agreement should set an indicative global target for the share of renewable energy in the UK and to ensure a level playing field. This target should be comparable to that of the European Union. Comparable. There is that word again. It essentially means matching whatever Brussels decides, regardless of whether it makes sense for Britain's specific circumstances, geography, or economic situation. Now let us examine what the EU internal electricity market actually is, because context matters here. The market treats all 27 EU countries plus Norway as a single borderless electricity grid. It is an ambitious project, undoubtedly, allowing electricity to flow freely across borders to wherever it is needed. In theory, this should improve efficiency and potentially reduce costs. In theory. But theory and practice are often very different beasts, particularly when politics gets involved. Ed Miliband, bless him, has set a target for the country's power generation to be 95% decarbonized by 2030. That is an extraordinarily ambitious goal, and whether it is actually achievable is another question entirely. But here's the kicker. Electricity accounts for just 1/5 of total domestic energy consumption. Just 1/5. So even if Miliband achieves his dream of near-total decarbonization of electricity generation, we are still only addressing 20% of the problem. The remaining 80%, all that heating, transport, and industry, that is where these new EU targets would really bite. Claire Coutinho did not mince a word when describing what this would mean. She said, bill payers should be very worried about what the Labour government is signing up to. The EU's Renewable Energy Directive is like all the worst parts of the UK Climate Change Act on steroids. On steroids? That is quite the image, is it not? Take all the controversial, expensive, and disruptive elements of existing climate legislation, inject them with performance-enhancing drugs, and you have got Brussels' renewable energy demands. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This is not just about climate policy or environmental targets. This is fundamentally about sovereignty and who gets to make decisions that affect British citizens. We spent years, literally years, debating Brexit, arguing about taking back control, border sovereignty, and making our own laws. Millions of people voted specifically to ensure Britain could set its own rules without interference from Brussels. And now, just a few years later, we are potentially signing agreements that would hand control of critical infrastructure back to the EU. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Energy security is not some abstract political concept. It is about whether your lights stay on, whether you can heat your home in winter, whether businesses can operate, and whether the economy can function. Giving another entity, particularly one we are no longer a member of, control over these decisions is an enormous leap. And it is a leap that many MPs from multiple parties are warning against. The government's response has been predictably bland and noncommittal. A Cabinet Office spokesperson said that an agreed text exchange between the EU and UK would form the basis of further talks in 2026. They claim that closer cooperation on electricity will bring real benefits to British businesses and consumers, helping to drive down energy costs, strengthen energy security, and drive investment in the North Sea. Then they added that delightful political classic, "We will not give a running commentary on ongoing talks." Translation: stop asking awkward questions. We will tell you what we have agreed to after we have already agreed to it. The timing of all this is rather suspicious as well. While the government has been talking tough about energy security and protecting consumers from price spikes, they have apparently been negotiating terms that could do the exact opposite. It is classic political misdirection. Look over here at these nice promises while we quietly sign away your energy independence over there. What makes this particularly galling for many observers is that we have already seen how EU energy policy can go catastrophically wrong. When Russia invaded Ukraine and gas supplies were threatened, European countries that had become overly dependent on interconnected systems and specific energy sources suddenly found themselves in crisis. Prices skyrocketed. Governments had to step in with enormous subsidies, and ordinary people suffered. Britain was not immune to these problems, but we had more flexibility precisely because we were not bound by EU energy mandates. And now we are considering voluntarily giving up that flexibility. The practical implications of doubling renewable energy targets in just 5 years are staggering. The infrastructure does not currently exist. The supply chains are not ready. The workforce is not trained. The technology, in many cases, is still developing. Rushing this process will inevitably lead to higher costs, corners being cut, and systems that do not work as promised. And who pays for all of this? Not the politicians making these decisions, not the bureaucrats in Brussels setting these targets, but ordinary working people who are already struggling with the cost of living. There is also the question of democratic accountability. If energy policy is subordinate to EU jurisdiction, who do British voters hold accountable when things go wrong? You cannot vote out European commissioners. You cannot protest effectively to Brussels if you are not an EU member. You become subject to rules you have no meaningful way to influence or change. That is not sovereignty, that is submission. The Labour government seems to be gambling that closer alignment with the EU on energy will somehow deliver benefits that outweigh these concerns. Perhaps they genuinely believe this will drive down costs and improve security. Or perhaps they are so ideologically committed to European cooperation that they are willing to accept terms that are fundamentally disadvantageous to Britain. Either way, the warnings from MPs across the political spectrum suggest this is not going to be an easy sell. So where does this leave us? Well, negotiations are apparently continuing into 2026, which means there is still time for things to change. Public pressure, parliamentary opposition, and sheer practicality might force a rethink. Or the government might push ahead regardless, convinced they know better than the experts, the critics, and the voters. We have seen that happen before, and it rarely ends well. What is clear is that this is not just a technical discussion about electricity grids and renewable percentages. This is about fundamental questions of sovereignty, democracy, and who gets to decide Britain's future.